clay friends. In this video, we're gonna take some pine cones and pour some plaster over them and turn them into sprig molds that you can use later to add texture to your work. We're gonna use a little bit of clay. If you have some old scrap clay, that's better because we're gonna pour plaster on it and that's gonna ruin the clay and we're gonna have to toss the clay anyway. We're gonna take a cup and cut rings and that's gonna help form our mold. And you can do this with any small object that doesn't have undercuts. Now we have a nice snug fit, but before I attach this completely, I'm gonna embed the pine cone into my clay. So the next thing I'm gonna do is cut out the shape of the pine cone so I can sink it down into the clay. So I'm picking the side on the pine cone that has the least amount of undercuts, and I'm gonna bury this more than halfway because it has these points coming off to the side. So I'm actually gonna bury this and just have about the top 1/3 showing. Some of my scraps and I'm going to roll out a coil and secure this outside. I'm working on a stainless steel table. You don't want to work on wood with plaster because if the plaster gets into the wood, you're not going to get it out. But I know from experience that plaster just scrapes right off the stainless steel. So I do most of my plaster work on this stainless steel table. The point of an extra coil around the outside here is just in case it looks like I have a really good seal between the cup and the inside clay, but in case I don't, it makes a really big mess. So it's easier just to be cautious and add an extra coil right now rather than clean up a huge mess later on. So we're just gonna use this and I'm just pushing that in and down. So I'm pushing it in and it's attaching to the cup and the clay underneath and then down to secure it to the table. Now I'm gonna cover my pine cones with a little bit of mold soap. You don't have to use mold soap, you can use dish detergent. I use that just as often. You wanna use a soft brush and you wanna apply it gently because you don't want to stir it up and agitate it and make a foam or it's gonna ruin the surface. We want a nice smooth surface to capture the texture of the pine cone. So I'm gonna use just a little bit, it doesn't take much. And I'm just gonna put a single coat over the pine cone, and this is gonna help it release from the plaster. I like to keep my plaster in a garbage can, and then I double wrap it in plastic garbage bags to keep the moisture out. It comes in 50-pound bags, and I rarely use a whole 50-pound bag at once. I also keep my recipe on the inside of the lid. So some people use the island method for their plaster, and I do sometimes, but I like to get a consistent hardness. And so I usually use this recipe. If I'm doing a larger mold, you can go length times width times height divided by 80, and that's gonna give you the number of quarts of water that you need to use. And then you can match that up with the number of pounds of plaster that you need to use. Okay, I'm gonna zero my scale and make sure that I'm set for pounds since I'm measuring 1 pound, 7 ounces. Grab a scoop and scoop up some plaster. And as always, it's a good idea to wear your N95 mask when working with plaster because it's dusty. I normally work under this fan. I don't have the fan on right now because it doesn't make for good video. We have 1 pound, 7 ounces of our plaster. I have 2 cups or 1 pint of water. So I'm gonna add the water to my mixing container first. And then I just mix with my hand because I like to feel for lumps in the bottom. Some people have skin sensitivities and you might need to wear a glove for that. I'm gonna gradually add the water here. And I'm sprinkling it around so that it can absorb the water equally and avoid getting lumps. It doesn't really start to set until I start to agitate it or stir it. So you can start to see some of the plaster is starting to stay on top. And so you can kind of compare the island method to measuring method and see, in theory, you should get about the same results. So now that I'm starting to get some on top with the island method, this is about when I would stop, and I'm about out of the plaster that I weighed out. So you should, in theory, get similar results. Just gonna add the last little bit of my plaster here. And I'm just gonna put my hand in and really gently start to mix this. And you can feel for lumps this way and just squeeze any lumps right out of it. I'm gonna double check my molds, make sure everything's still nice and attached. If there's any mold soap pooling around the edges, I want the mold soap on my object, but not pooling around the edges. I don't see any in this case, but I keep a little piece of paper towel or tissue handy, and I would go in and dab that. You just don't want any pools of the mold soap. It can affect the way the plaster sets. So I'm just gonna pour this in. I want to go very slowly because again, we want a nice smooth surface. We don't want to create any air bubbles. And we want to go to about 1 inch over the pine cone so that it has good absorbency. Always keeping my eye out for leaks. Make sure we don't have any plaster leaking out the side. And then if you have plaster left over, you can keep spare containers in different shapes and pour it into a bowl or something and make yourself a nice slump mold or something too, so you don't have to waste it. If you don't have a mold handy, you want to dilute this with water and then dump it outside. Do not put this down your sink. You do not want plaster in your plumbing. This plaster's been setting up about 1.5 hours now. You'll notice as it cures, it heats up for 20 or 30 minutes and then it cools back down. It's soft. It won't be fully cured for about a week, but it's firm enough that you can release it, and it's still soft enough that you can smooth off any rough edges. Since you're going to be handling the sprig mold a lot, you want to make sure there's no sharp edges. So just going to release this coil that we put around the outside. In case your clay has firmed up a bit, I'm just using a loop tool to kind of scrape away that outer coil. And then we'll lift these straight up. The cup just tears away. Okay, so we've got this up off the table. I'm gonna peel away the cup and peel away the clay. And remember, don't reuse this clay. Don't try to reuse it, just toss it. Once it has plaster in it and contaminating it, you don't want to try to fire that. So this is just throw away. Okay. You can see that sometimes it leaves a bit of a sharp edge. You can take like a green scrubby and just very gently go around that sharp edge and smooth it off. The plaster is soft enough that this is an easy time to get rid of any sharp edges. And remember, you're going to be handling these a lot, so you want to make sure that there's nothing sharp and that they're comfortable on your hands. Okay, here's our pine cone. And here's our sprig mold. Here's our bigger pine cone. And so you can see now that we're looking at this angle, how I covered it in clay more than halfway. So you can see that there's quite a bit of it now that I've pulled the clay away sticking up, and that avoids those undercuts. So this should pull out of here without too much effort and kind of rock it back and forth a little. After you go around with a green scrubby and smooth off any edges, you can really quickly rinse it under water just one time. From then on, for normal cleaning and maintenance, just sponge this out. You never want to saturate the plaster again after that. So I'm going to set these aside and let these cure for about a week before I try to use them. The other thing is, we talked a little bit about having some overflow. If you mix too much plaster, it's nice to have a shape to pour it into, and then you can use that for a mold in the future too. So I made 2 small molds here. These, sometimes they pop right out. Sometimes you have to tap them a little bit. This one just popped right out. And I would do the same thing. The edge right here is pretty sharp. I would go around the edge with a green scrubby just to smooth that off. The sharp edges also grab and chip more easily, so I find that if you smooth off the edges, it's less likely to chip in the future. Once your sprig molds have cured, you can take some soft clay, and you want to make sure that the side that you're putting down into the mold doesn't have any cracks or creases in it, so get it one side nice and smooth, and then just press that down into your sprig mold. Get rid of some of the extra. And depending on the mold, some of them work a little bit better if you let them set up 5 or 10 minutes. Some of them you can just make repeatedly without much break in between. This one doesn't need a lot of setting up time. So I've got it in my mold. If I want to, I can let it sit up 5 minutes, but I don't have to. I can just take it. And you can see I've rolled out a little slab of clay. The easiest way to get this out without handling it is just to slap it down on the clay and lift it straight up. And the idea is we want to handle the sprig molds as little as possible, because the whole point is to preserve this cool texture that we made with the plaster. The one at this end has been sitting up 5 or 10 minutes, so once it firms up on the outside a little bit, then you can handle it a little bit easier without distorting the shape. So I just go in and I shave that top off. And what I can do now is slip and score the back and attach that to any sculpture or bowl or mug that I want to add a pine cone to. I generally slip and score the back, attach it, and then just run a paintbrush with water around the edges to make sure it's secured nice and tight.